The human heart is a complex landscape, often hidden behind the simple face of a child or the steady hands of a craftsman, yet capable of shifting into shadow when the weight of the world becomes too heavy to bear. We travel tonight back through the fog of time, leaving the neon glow of the modern world behind to find ourselves in the late 19th century, a period of transition where the industrial gears of the Gilded Age ground against the fragile edges of human sanity. It is a world of gaslight and cobblestones, where the air in the crowded tenements of Chicago and the high, thin atmosphere of the Colorado Rockies carried the scent of coal smoke and the quiet desperation of those living on the margins. We find our first quiet observation in the life of a man named John Wolker, a German immigrant of 52 years who made his living as a carpenter. He was a man of medium height and lean frame, a person whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of shaping wood, finding order in the grain of a plank even as the structure of his own domestic life began to splinter into pieces. The year is 1897, and the winter chill has begun to settle over the sprawling gray streets of Chicago. We see John in his workshop, the rhythmic sound of his plain shaving curls of cedar, providing a temporary sanctuary from a home life that had grown increasingly cold. John had walked a long road to reach this point. After the death of his first wife, he had boarded out his 2 children with his sister, eventually entering into a second marriage that was less a union of souls and more a contract of convenience. His second wife was a robust woman, a sharp contrast to John's thinning frame, and the 2 of them shared a home that was frequently filled with the sharp, biting sounds of discord. Jealousy is a slow-burning fire, and in the Wolker household, it had been smoldering for 3 or 4 years, fed by distrust and the harsh realities of a life lived in cramped quarters. On a particular evening that would change everything, the air inside their home was thick with the smell of cabbage and the stale tang of whiskey and beer. John had been drinking, seeking a temporary veil to pull over the grievances of the day. But the alcohol only served to sharpen his agitation. A quarrel broke out, the words flying like sparks, until the frenzy of his wife's conduct pushed him toward a shelf where an old, heavy pistol had sat undisturbed for a long time. It was an object of iron and wood, cold to the touch and heavy with the potential for finality. In a moment of clouded judgment, a moment he would later claim was a blur of instinct rather than intent, John discharged the weapon toward the shadows where his wife and her 2 little girls were standing. The crack of the gunshot was followed by a silence so profound it seemed to stop the ticking of the clock on the mantel. When the smoke cleared, it was discovered that the bullet had missed his wife, but had mortally wounded the child who had been John's favorite, the one bright light in his otherwise dim existence. According to the records of the time, when John later recounted these events, he would fall into long spells of hysterical sobbing, his lean shoulders shaking as he spoke of his willingness to die, if it could only bring the child back. The court looked upon his distraught form and noted a certain mental weakness, a fragility of the mind that had snapped under the pressure of provocation. Instead of the gallows, the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, recognizing that while the life had been taken, the man standing before them was not a monster of calculation, but a broken individual who had been a peaceful citizen until one tragic, whiskey-soaked night. By the next morning, The carpenter was gone from the streets of Chicago, replaced by a number in a cell, left to contemplate the grain of the wood in his floor, and the daughter who would never again run to meet him at the door. As the heavy iron doors close on the story of John Wolker, we drift through the snowy streets of the city to another workshop, where the smell of sawdust and varnish hangs thick in the air. Here we meet Matt Rollinger, a 34-year-old cabinet maker from Luxembourg. Matt was a man of steady habits, a skilled mechanic known for his industry and his quiet, almost stolid disposition. He had a wife and 3 children, and for a time his life followed the predictable, comforting rhythm of work and home. But a shadow had entered his house in the form of a boarder, a man whose presence began to erode the foundations of Matt's peace. Rumors began to drift through the neighborhood, whispers of an intimacy between the boarder and Mrs. Rollinger that Matt at first tried to ignore. But eventually, the weight of the evidence became impossible to carry. We find ourselves in the dim, gray light of an early morning in 1897. Matt, driven to a state of bewildered frenzy by what he had witnessed in his own home, decided to take matters into his own hands. In a strange, desperate attempt at disguise, he attired himself partly in female clothing, perhaps hoping to blend into the early morning shadows as he lay in wait with a pistol. The air was crisp, the light still pale and uncertain, when a figure approached through the mist. Believing he had finally found the man who had betrayed his hospitality, Matt fired. The figure fell heavily to the cobblestones. When Matt rushed forward, the adrenaline fading into a cold, sickening realization. He found that he had not killed his enemy. Instead, he had shot his friend and neighbor, an innocent man caught in the crossfire of a broken heart. The investigation found Matt on the spot moments later, not fleeing, but standing in a state of demented shock. Those who knew him testified to his peaceful nature, describing him as a childish, harmless creature who had simply been pushed beyond the limits of his endurance. At his trial, it was whispered by the jurymen that had he killed the actual object of his fury, he likely would have been acquitted. Such was the understanding of a man's honor in those days. However, the tragedy of the mistake could not be overlooked. To ensure the safety of the community, he was sentenced to 14 years in the penitentiary. The once proud cabinet maker, a man of skill and quiet dignity, slowly drifted into a melancholic state, his mind retreating further into the stillness of his confinement. George tramped through the countryside, seeking odd jobs and shelter, eventually finding work with a farmer. But the irritability that often accompanied his condition made the world a hostile place. One morning, after a visit to a local saloon where the whiskey burned in his throat, George walked to his employer's barn. Without a clear understanding of what possessed him, he struck a match and watched as the hay ignited, the flames leaping up to consume the structure. When he was caught, George could offer no reason other than a vague feeling that he had been treated meanly. In the quiet of his jail cell, he would spend his nights reading the New Testament and muttering prayers in a rhythmic blend of French and Latin, a desperate attempt to find some form of grace in a life defined by fire and fits. As the embers of George Perry's story fade, we turn our gaze toward a young woman whose face was a common sight in the crowded department stores of Chicago. She was 20 years old, her name lost to the formal records, but her habits well documented. She was a shoplifter, a fly girl with a pleasant, intelligent face that masked a calculated daring. Her career in crime had begun early, rooted in a childhood where she would steal cabbage money from her mother, just to have a few extra coins. By the age of 11, she was lifting watches from downtown stores, and by 17, she had joined a schoolmate in a life of systematic thievery. She moved through the crowded aisles like a ghost, slipping silks, jewelry, and jackets under her cape, her eyes always scanning for the next opportunity. She had no taste for novels or the slow pace of school. She preferred the adrenaline of the hunt and the quick exchange of stolen goods at a local fence. Yet, even she held a quiet belief in a future state of rewards and punishments, a small, lingering thread of the Catholic upbringing she had otherwise abandoned. Finally, we travel west, where the air is thin and the mountains of Colorado rise like jagged teeth against the horizon. Here we encounter the most chilling figure of our anthology, Anton Woode. In 1892, Anton was just 11 years old, a boy who lived on a ranch near Denver. One afternoon, while out hunting with a companion named Joseph Smith, Anton leveled his rifle and shot the other boy in the back. The motive was not a quarrel or an accident, but a cold, covetous desire for Joseph's gold watch and chain. When Anton was caught, he showed no remorse, only a vicious regret that he hadn't plugged the witnesses as well, so that no one would have known of the deed. During his trial, doctors argued that his mental constitution had been lowered by the consumption of coffee, a theory that seems as thin as the mountain air today. But at the time, it served to explain the inexplicable coldness of a child killer. Anton was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor, a prospect that seemed to please him because he believed it meant he would have enough to eat without having to work. However, the stillness of the prison could not hold him. In 1900, Anton and 3 others staged an escape that left a guard dead and a community in terror. While Anton was eventually recaptured, the violence he left in his wake served as a grim reminder of the thin line between a child's innocence and a predator's heart. As the sun sets over the rugged peaks of the West and the gaslights of Chicago begin to flicker and dim, we leave these stories behind. The figures of John, Matt, George, the young shoplifter, and little Anton fade back into the historical record, their tragedies and malices resolved by the passage of a century. You are safe now, tucked away from the echoes of the past as the world outside slows to a rhythmic, peaceful crawl. The shadows of the Gilded Age have long since lengthened and disappeared, leaving only the quiet stillness of the night to watch over you. Sleep now, for the stories are told, and the silence of the night remains unbroken. The pursuit of something small and glimmering can often cast a shadow far larger than the object itself. We find ourselves now in the late autumn of 1892, specifically in the rugged, high-altitude terrain of the Colorado Territory. The air in these foothills is thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dried pine needles and the distant, metallic promise of winter snow. In this landscape, the silence is heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of a dry branch or the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen earth. It was here, amidst the sprawling expanse of the Woode family ranch near Denver, that a young boy named Anton Woode lived a life defined by the hard edges of frontier survival. Anton was only 11 years old, a child who should have been occupied with the simple rhythms of school or the light chores of a farmhouse. Yet his mind was already drifting toward a dark and quiet resolve. On a cold November afternoon, the geography of the ranch became the stage for a tragedy that would haunt the region for decades. Anton was out hunting, a common enough activity for a boy of his age in the 1890s, accompanied by another youth named Joseph Smith. Joseph was a boy of similar age, but he carried with him a small token of a more comfortable life. A gold watch and chain that caught the pale Colorado sunlight with every movement. To Anton, that watch was not just a timepiece. It was a symbol of an unattainable elegance, a gleaming anchor in a world of gray dust and manual labor. As the two boys moved through the brush, the sensory details of the afternoon remained mundane. The weight of the rifles in their hands, the puff of their breath in the cold air, and the steady, ticking pulse of the watch in Joseph's pocket. The investigation would later reveal that the transition from a quiet hunt to a crime of cold calculation happened in a single, muted moment. Without a word or warning, Anton raised his rifle and fired a single shot into Joseph's back. The violence was sudden, but the narrative that followed was one of eerie, detached calm. According to the reports from the time, Anton did not flee in a panic or cry out in horror. Instead, he reached down and took the gold watch, the very item he had envied so deeply. This act was not born of a sudden heat, but of a quiet, internal pressure that had been building within the boy's mind. When he was eventually taken into custody, the stillness of his demeanor was what struck the authorities most. He confessed almost immediately, his voice flat and devoid of the frantic energy one might expect from a child. He told the officers that he simply wanted the watch. It was a motive as simple as it was chilling, grounded in a desire that outweighed the value of a human life. As we look back through the fog of over a century, the details of Anton's first trial emerge as a study in legal and medical confusion. The proceedings began in a courtroom filled with the smell of wood smoke and damp wool. As the community struggled to reconcile the image of a small, 11-year-old boy with the reality of a cold-blooded killer, the jury found themselves caught in a stalemate, unable to agree on the boy's sanity. Some saw a monster in a child's frame, while others saw a victim of a harsh environment, or perhaps a mind that had not yet fully formed. The trial ended in a hung jury, leaving the fate of Colorado's youngest killer suspended in the cooling air of the late 19th century. However, the law is often persistent, and a second trial was convened shortly thereafter. By March 24, 1893, the atmosphere had shifted. The defense attempted to explain Anton's actions through the medical lens of the time, with one doctor testifying that the boy's habit of drinking coffee had lowered his mental constitution, leading to a form of insanity. It was a reflection of the era's burgeoning and often misguided understanding of psychology. Despite these efforts, the second jury reached a different conclusion. Anton was found guilty of second-degree murder. When the verdict was read, the boy who had remained so stoic finally broke, weeping not out of remorse for Joseph Smith, but out of a visceral fear of the gallows. He believed the sentence meant he would be hanged. a prospect that momentarily shattered his icy exterior. Yet, even in his grief, a darkness remained. He would later express a chilling regret, not for the life he took, but for the fact that he hadn't killed Joseph's two companions as well, believing that if he had plugged the witnesses, he might have remained a free boy on the Colorado plains. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. The gentle hum of the night provides a perfect backdrop for the mind to wander. And so I invite you now to settle into your blankets and let the world outside fade away. Tonight, we travel to the year 1892, where a gold watch cost a man his life and a boy his soul. We find ourselves in the final years of the 19th century, a time when the law was absolute, yet the inner workings of the human mind remained a profound mystery. It was a cold, Victorian-era evening in Colorado. Imagine the sound of a heavy iron key turning in a lock, the vibrations traveling through the cold metal into the warden's hand. Outside, the flickering of a gas lamp casts long, dancing shadows against a weathered brick wall. There is a specific stillness to this era, broken only by the rhythmic metallic clink of the warden's ring as he walks the silent corridors. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, clinging to heavy wool coats, a scent that defines the winter of the American West. A yellow fog, characteristic of the era's industrial breath, swallows the silhouettes of horse-drawn carriages clattering over the cobblestones, turning the world into a series of ghostly shapes. In this atmosphere of fading light and biting cold, we begin to explore the case of Anton Woode. He was a boy of only 11 years, small in stature but possessing a disposition that baffled the seasoned lawmen of the Rockies. At an age when most children were preoccupied with school books or chores on the ranch, Anton was facing the looming shadow of the gallows. His crime was not one of passion or accident, but a cold calculation driven by the shimmer of a gold chain. The authorities at the time struggled to reconcile his youth with his actions. Was he a child who had lost his way? Or was there something fundamentally different about the way his mind functioned? As we journey back to the Colorado Territory, we see a legal system grappling with a boy who seemed entirely indifferent to the gravity of his situation. The promise of tonight's story is not just a retelling of a crime, but a deep immersion into his impossible bid for freedom and the dark corridors of the Colorado State Penitentiary. We will look closely at the trial that nearly ended in a hanging, the strange medical theories of the day, and the eventual, desperate escape attempt that would leave the community in a state of shock. For now, simply breathe. The events of 1892 are far behind us, frozen in history like the frost on a Denver window pane. You are safe, you are warm, and the story is just beginning to unfold. As the heavy doors of the jailhouse groaned on their hinges, Anton Woode stepped into a world of stone and iron. The transition from the open plains of his family's ranch to the cramped, suffocating reality of a cell was one that would break most men, let alone a child. But Anton was not like most children. While others his age might have wept for their mothers, Anton's eyes were fixed on the rogues gallery, the collection of photographs featuring the territory's most wanted and most unfortunate. It was here, amidst the scent of damp stone and lye, that the true nature of his journey began. The law viewed him as a monster in a small frame. But to the doctors and keepers of the prison, he was a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit the world they knew. The investigation into the shooting of Joseph Smith had revealed a chilling level of premeditation. Anton hadn't just fired a weapon. He had waited for the perfect moment when the glitter of that gold watch was most prominent. When the sheriff first sat him down, the boy didn't offer excuses. He spoke of the watch with a sense of entitlement that sent shivers through the room. It was this lack of remorse that led to a legal battle unlike any other in Colorado's history. 2 trials were required to decide the fate of a boy who seemed to prefer the idea of prison food and shelter over the hard labor of the ranch. As we move deeper into the night, we will see how this boy's path eventually led to the high walls of Cannon City and the violent break for freedom that would define his legacy. To understand the world that awaited young Anton Woode, we must first step into the heavy, dimly lit atmosphere of a 19th century courtroom. The year 1893 carried a weight that is difficult to imagine in our modern era of bright lights and digital records. In the late 1890s, the legal landscape was a place of tactile grit and absolute, often unforgiving, finality. We can almost hear the rhythmic scritch-scratch of a steel-nibbed pen as a clerk records testimony on ledger paper, the surface of the page rough and yellowed even then. The room is filled with a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional shift of a heavy wooden bench or the low, guttering hiss of a gas lamp. In the corner, a potbelly stove glows a dull, cherry red, providing the only real warmth against the biting Colorado chill that seeps through the window frames. This was the safe container of history, a rigid structure designed to maintain order in a territory that still felt the pulse of the wild frontier. Yet, within these walls, the law was grappling with concepts that were still in their infancy. Legal scholars and doctors of the day were beginning to pull at the threads of what they called the mental weakness defense. It was a precursor to our modern understanding of diminished capacity, but far more rudimentary and subjective. In this era, the boundary between a child and a criminal was as thin as the mountain air, and the transition from a schoolroom to a cell block could happen in the blink of an eye. The jurors who sat in judgment of Anton were men of their time, hardened by manual labor, often skeptical of the emerging alienists or early psychiatrists who suggested that a person's constitution could be warped by something as simple as their environment or their habits. During the trial, a doctor actually testified that Anton's mental state had been compromised because the boy drank coffee, a habit believed to overstimulate a young mental constitution and lead to insanity. It seems strange to us now, but these were the theories that decided a life. The court functioned on a blend of strict moral Victorianism and a burgeoning, if clumsy, scientific curiosity. The heavy scent of wood smoke and damp wool hung in the air as they debated whether a boy who had not yet reached puberty possessed the malice aforethought required for a murder conviction. They were looking at a child, but they were searching for a monster, trying to reconcile the small hands of a boy with the cold calculation of a killer who coveted a gold watch. As we look back, we see that the legal system wasn't just trying Anton Woode. It was trying to define the very nature of responsibility. Would you like me to walk you through the specific testimony of the witnesses who watched this 11-year-old boy stand before the bench to receive a sentence of 25 years of hard labor? The courtroom in 1893 was a place of heavy oak and stifling air, where the collective gaze of Denver fell upon a child who seemed entirely disconnected from the gravity of his actions. As the judge prepared to speak, the silence in the room was brittle, broken only by the distant sound of a horse and carriage passing on the street outside. Anton Woode stood there, a small figure in a space designed for men, his face a mask of youthful indifference that chilled those who looked upon it. When the clerk finally rose to read the verdict of murder in the second degree, a sudden and sharp change came over the boy. The composure he had maintained throughout the 16 hours of jury deliberation vanished, replaced by a frantic, weeping realization. Yet his tears were not shed for Joseph Smith, the friend he had shot in the back for the sake of a gold watch and chain. Instead, Anton wept because he believed the words meant he was headed for the gallows. The raw instinct for self-preservation was the only language he seemed to speak fluently. In the wake of the verdict, his sorrow quickly curdled into a cold, redirected rage. He turned his eyes toward Alexander Pecker, the state's principal witness, and leveled a glare that observers described as truly vicious. With a chilling lack of remorse, the 11-year-old muttered that if he had only plugged the other two companions who had been present that day on the ranch, no one would have known anything about the crime at all. It was a moment of profound clarity for the court. They were not dealing with a confused child, but a mind that viewed human life as a mere obstacle to be removed. Later, within the confines of the sheriff's office, the boy's attention was captured by the rogues gallery. He stared at a photograph of a desperado's body dangling from a telegraph pole. The image, a grim testament to frontier justice. He asked the sheriff if that was to be his fate as well, and when he was assured that he would only be confined in jail, his entire demeanor shifted once more. The prospect of having enough to eat and no labor to perform actually seemed to delight him. However, the reality of the Colorado State Penitentiary at Cannon City would prove to be far less comfortable than the boy imagined. Sentenced to 25 years of hard labor, Anton was thrust into a world of gray stone, iron bars, and the rhythmic clinking of hammers, a place where the silence of the high desert was the only company for a boy who had traded his soul for a ticking piece of gold. The high mountain air in Colorado has a way of carrying sound that feels almost unnatural, as if the thin atmosphere refuses to let a single vibration go to waste. In November of 1892, that air was biting, a cold that settled deep into the marrow, turning the damp earth of the Woode family ranch into a brittle crust of silver frost and frozen pine needles. We find ourselves walking behind two figures cutting through the timber. One is Joseph Smith, a young man full of the vigor of the hunt, and the other is Anton Woode, a boy of only 11 years whose small, ungloved hands were wrapped around the cold steel and wood of a .22 caliber rifle. The weight of the firearm was significant for a child of his stature, a heavy reminder of the adult world he was so eager to inhabit. The only sound in the vastness of the woods was the rhythmic crunch of Anton's boots, breaking the icy skin of the forest floor. Just ahead, Joseph moved with an easy confidence, his breath blooming in thick, white clouds of condensation that vanished into the pines just as quickly as they appeared. He paused for a moment, glancing back with a gruff but genuine kindness in his eyes. "Keep up, Anton," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly through the stillness. "The deer won't wait for a slow boy." Joseph turned back to the trail, his mind likely on the tracks ahead or the warmth of a hearth waiting at the end of the day. He had no reason to fear the shadow trailing him. Anton did not answer. Instead, he began a silent, internal counting of the seconds, a private clock ticking toward a definitive end. He watched the steady movement of Joseph's back, but his eyes were drawn repeatedly to a specific glint of light. There, resting against the dark fabric of Joseph's vest, was a gold watch chain. It swayed slightly with every step, a shimmering tether to a prize that Anton had decided was worth more than a life. The boy's finger found the trigger guard, the metal leaching the last of the warmth from his skin. The silence of the woods was suddenly punctuated by the sharp, mechanical click of the hammer being drawn back. It was a small sound, but in the Colorado wilderness, it was an alarm. Before Joseph could turn, before the question could even form in his mind, the rifle discharged. A plume of sulphurous black powder filled the air, the acrid smell of burnt saltpeter clashing with the clean scent of evergreen. Joseph collapsed into the snow without a cry, the white powder beneath him staining as the life force ebbed away. In that moment, the ticking of the gold watch seemed to grow louder in the vacuum of the forest. For the price of a ticking gold watch, a boy of 11 stepped out of childhood and into the iron-gray world of the Colorado legal system. Anton did not flee the scene in a panic. He stood over the fallen Joseph, his gaze fixed on the mechanical treasure he had coveted. The legal storm that followed would be one for the history books, as the state struggled to reconcile the innocence of a child's face with the cold calculation of a killer's heart. The investigation began almost immediately after the body was discovered, and the ranch, once a place of quiet labor, became a focal point of a national debate on the nature of evil. As the sun sets over the frost-bitten ranch in Denver, we travel now to the interior of a crowded courtroom, where a different kind of silence was taking hold, a silence of disbelief as a legal team prepared an argument that would link a boy's breakfast to his capacity for murder. The heavy oak doors of the Denver courtroom creaked under the pressure of a curious public, sealing out the biting Colorado wind and trapping an air thick with the scents of wet cedar and stale tobacco. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, humid from the steam rising off the damp wool overcoats of spectators who had squeezed into every available inch of the wooden pews. At the center of this grim spectacle sat Anton Woode, a figure so diminutive he seemed swallowed by the machinery of the law. His small legs dangled from a chair designed for a grown man, his boots swaying back and forth several inches above the floorboards. To the bearded men of the jury, he looked less like a cold-blooded killer, more like a child waiting for a school lesson to begin. Yet the charges against him were of the most permanent and dark nature. The legal proceedings were not a single event, but a grueling journey through two separate trials. The first had ended in a stalemate, a hung jury unable to reconcile the boy's tender age with the calculated violence of the act. As the second trial commenced in March of 1893, the defense leaned heavily into a theory that would become a flashpoint of medical and legal history. Dr. Eskridge, a prominent physician of the era, took the stand to offer an explanation that seemed to baffle the rugged pioneers in attendance. He spoke of underdeveloped nerves and the delicate constitution of a child's growing mind. The doctor's focus settled on a seemingly mundane detail of the Woode household: the boy's morning routine. According to the medical testimony, Anton's nerves had been subjected to a constant, jarring overstimulation. The culprit, Eskridge argued, was the excessive consumption of strong coffee at the breakfast table. In the late 19th century, the boundaries of nutritional science were still being charted, and the doctor posited that the caffeine had acted as a toxicant on Anton's immature nervous system. He suggested that the stimulant had induced a state of temporary moral paralysis, a condition where the boy's ability to distinguish right from wrong was effectively short-circuited by a chemical storm in his brain. In a courtroom filled with bearded men, a physician argued that the caffeine in a morning cup of coffee had unraveled the moral fabric of a young boy's mind. The spectators listened in a stunned hush as Eskridge described how the coffee defense explained the lack of remorse. It was argued that the boy was not inherently evil, but rather medically compromised, his nerves stretched to a breaking point by a common beverage. Despite this creative medical plea, the second jury found themselves less swayed by the science of stimulation. They looked at the empty seat where Joseph Smith should have been and saw only the gold watch that had sparked the tragedy. On March 24, 1893, the verdict was read aloud: guilty of murder in the second degree. When the words echoed through the chamber, Anton did not react with the stoicism of a hardened criminal. He wept, but his tears were born of a terrifying misunderstanding. He believed the verdict meant he was to be taken immediately to the gallows. Even as the judge sentenced him to 25 years of hard labor, the boy's mind remained fixed on the violence he had committed and the violence he felt he had missed. Looking at Alexander Pecker, the witness whose testimony had sealed his fate, Anton's weeping turned to a sharp, cold venom. He muttered that if he had only plugged the witnesses too, no one would have ever known the truth. This flash of darkness chilled the room more than any winter draft could, suggesting that perhaps the moral unraveling went much deeper than a cup of coffee. As he was led away toward the sheriff's office, the weight of his future began to settle, though the boy's transition from a ranch hand to a ward of the state was only just beginning. The steel door of the sheriff's office creaked on heavy hinges, closing out the murmur of the courtroom and the judgment of the town. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of ink. Anton was led to a wooden bench, his boots barely scuffing the floorboards as he moved with a strange, unsettling grace. His eyes, sharp and alert, immediately began to scan the room, settling on a wall crowded with history's darker side. This was the Rogues Gallery, a mosaic of grainy, black and white dead or alive posters pinned haphazardly to the rough-hewn timber. The light in the office was dim, filtered through a window where the late afternoon sun cast long, rhythmic shadows. Outside, a telegraph pole stood like a lonely sentinel, and as the wind swayed the wires, its flickering shadow danced across the posters on the wall, creating the illusion that the faces in the photographs were shifting. Anton stood up and walked toward them, his presence small against the gallery of outlaws. He reached out a hand, tracing the edges of a photograph with a small, dirty fingernail. The image showed a man at the end of his journey, a desperado dangling from a telegraph pole, his body limp and his story finished. Anton's finger lingered on the texture of the rope depicted in the grainy print, a tactile connection to the ultimate price of the law. Sheriff McGinnis watched the boy from behind his desk, perhaps expecting to see a flicker of fear or a tremor of realization. Instead, Anton turned away from the wall and looked toward the corner of the room where Alexander Pecker stood. Pecker had been the principal witness, the man whose testimony had bridged the gap between a tragic accident and a calculated act. Anton's expression shifted, his youthful features hardening into a look so vicious it seemed to belong to someone decades older. In a voice quiet but laced with a stinging obscenity, he muttered that if he had only plugged Pecker, nobody would have ever known a thing about the crime. It was a moment of chilling clarity. The boy did not regret the life taken, only the witnesses left behind to tell the tale. The sheriff moved to lead him toward the cell block, hoping to break the tension of the room. As they walked past the gallery one last time, Anton stopped and pointed again at the man on the pole. He looked up at the sheriff, his eyes steady and devoid of the tears he had shed in the courtroom. "I suppose that's what you're going to do with me?" he asked, his voice flat. Before the man could answer, the boy added with a haunting confidence, "Well, I'll fool you." When the sheriff assured him that his fate was not the rope, but the quiet confinement of a cell, a visible wave of relief and something akin to joy washed over the boy. To Anton, the prospect of the jail was not a punishment, but a strange kind of sanctuary. He was led into a small stone room where a cot stood covered in a coarse gray wool prison blanket. He sat down and ran his hand over the rough fabric, feeling the weight and the warmth of it. To a child who had known the biting winds of the Colorado ranch and the uncertainty of a hard life, this small, barred space offered a bizarre comfort. He remarked that it felt better than home, tickled by the idea that here there would be enough to eat and no labor to perform. He curled into the stillness of the cell, the flickering shadow of the telegraph pole still waving across the floor, like a beckoning hand from the world he was leaving behind. While the young prisoner adjusted to the stone-cold certainty of his new life in the Colorado cells, our journey takes us eastward to the humid air of Chicago in the year 1897. Here, we encounter Matt Rollinger, a man whose hands were built for creation, not destruction. Matt was a cabinet maker by trade, a native of Luxembourg who had brought his skill with fine wood and delicate joinery to the growing American city. He was 34 years old, a man of stolid, industrious habits, who found deep satisfaction in the scent of fresh cedar and the smooth finish of a well-planed surface. He lived with his wife and 3 children, and for a time, their home was anchored by the quiet rhythm of his workshop. However, the stability of Matt's life began to splinter when a boarder took up residence in their house, bringing with him a subtle, corrosive tension that would eventually rot the foundations of the Rollinger family. Rumors began to drift through the neighborhood like wood smoke, reaching Matt's ears and settling there with a heavy, persistent weight. It was whispered that an intimacy had formed between his wife and this guest, a betrayal that Matt initially struggled to comprehend. He was a simple, perhaps even childish man in his emotional makeup, possessing a disposition that was generally regarded as peaceable and kind. But as the weeks passed, the suspicion transformed into a certainty that he could no longer withstand. The artisan's precision that guided his work began to fail him, replaced by a frenzied, bewildered state of mind. He did not seek a lawyer or a divorce. Instead, he sought a way to vanish into the periphery of his own life so that he might catch the shadow of his rival in the act. In the pre-dawn hours of a damp morning, the woods surrounding the outskirts of the settlement were thick with a heavy, clinging mist. The air carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, a cold dampness that seeped through fabric and chilled the skin. Inside his home, Matt performed a strange and desperate ritual. He reached for his wife's clothing, pulling on a dress of silk and lace. He hoped that by adopting this feminine disguise, he could move through the twilight undetected, appearing as nothing more than a passing woman to any casual observer. The rustle of the silk was a sharp, delicate sound in the silence of the 4 o'clock hour, a stark contrast to the heavy, slick grip of the nickel-plated revolver he concealed within the folds of the fabric. He stepped out into the early twilight, a distorted figure haunting the edges of the trees. He lay in wait, his breath hitching in the cold air as he watched the path for the exit of his enemy. The world was cast in shades of deep blue and charcoal, the kind of dim light that plays tricks on the eyes and turns familiar shapes into monsters. Not long after his vigil began, a form emerged from the gloom. The light was still dim when the form approached, a shadow that Matt believed was the thief of his peace. His mind, clouded by exhaustion and the singular focus of his fury, did not allow for doubt. He raised the revolver, the metal cold against his palm, and fired. The sharp crack of the gunshot shattered the morning stillness. The figure crumpled instantly, falling heavily onto the damp ground. Matt rushed forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, expecting to look down upon the face of the man who had ruined his home. But as he drew a lantern from the brush and struck a match, the warm, flickering glow revealed a devastating truth. The light hit the dead man's face, illuminating the familiar features not of his rival, but of his best friend and neighbor. In that moment of discovery, the frenzy that had driven Matt dissipated, leaving behind a hollow, melancholic shell. He did not flee. When the authorities arrived, they found him standing over the body in his silk and lace disguise, a man entirely undone by his own hand. The investigation would later note that he was in a state of total bewilderment, a stolid creature who seemed to have lost his tether to reality. The neighbors who knew him as a skilled mechanic and a peaceful father watched in a different kind of silence as he was led away. The tragedy was doubled by the fact that his intended target remained unharmed, while a completely innocent man lay still in the woods. During the trial, the jury grappled with the strange nature of the crime. Matt's reputation as an industrious and quiet man worked in his favor, yet the finality of his mistake could not be ignored. It was whispered by some of the jurymen that had he actually killed the man he intended to, the unwritten codes of the time might have led to an acquittal. But because he had taken the life of a friend, the law required a different kind of accounting. The court eventually settled on a sentence of 14 years in the penitentiary, a middle ground for a man they deemed too dangerous to free immediately. but too broken to execute. Matt Rollinger was sent away, his mind drifting further into a demented, quiet state, leaving the woods and his workshop behind forever. The gavel's final strike did not sound like justice to those in the gallery. It sounded like the lid of a heavy wooden chest closing for the last time. For Matt Rollinger, the number 14 became the boundary of his existence. 14 years in the penitentiary, a span of time that felt both mercifully short to the law and an eternity to a man whose mind was already unraveling into the gray mists of dementia. As the guards led him away from the light of the courtroom, the stolid, childlike cabinet maker did not look back at the world he was leaving behind. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic gait, his boots scuffing against the polished floor, a stark contrast to the precise, delicate movements he once used to join dovetails and sand down the rough edges of walnut and oak. When the iron door finally swung shut at the Joliet facility, the echo was hollow, vibrating through the cold stone of the corridor long after the latch had clicked into place. This was the new reality for a man who had been a creature of industry and quiet skill. In the cramped confines of his cell, the air was thick with the smell of damp lime and old tobacco, a far cry from the sweet, sharp scent of fresh cedar shavings that had once coated his clothes. The transition from the workshop to the stone box was a slow, agonizing death of the spirit. Matt's hands, those large calloused tools of a master mechanic, could not remain still. For decades, they had known the resistance of grain and the bite of the chisel. But here, there was no wood to shape. Instead, Matt sat on the edge of his narrow cot, his shoulders hunched forward in a permanent state of melancholy. His fingers began a restless, repetitive dance. They sought out the rough texture of the walls, finding the thin lines of mortar between the massive prison stones. With a mindless, rhythmic motion, he began to pick at the crumbling lime, his fingernails turning gray with dust. It was the only outlet left for a man whose life had been defined by manual precision. He scraped and traced the seams of his confinement as if he were trying to find a flaw in the joinery of his own cage. The skilled hands of a cabinet maker, now idle in the gloom, reduced to carving nothingness out of the silence. The guards who passed by his bars noted that he rarely spoke. He had become a ghost before his time, a harmless individual, as the report stated, who seemed to have forgotten the very fury that had led him to that dim twilight in the woods. The bewildered and frenzied state he had exhibited on the day of the accidental killing had settled into a deep, permanent stagnation. He was no longer the man who had donned female garb in a desperate, misguided attempt at vengeance. He was simply a prisoner, a number, a body occupying space, while his mind drifted further into the shadows. According to the accounts of the time, the penitentiary was not a place of rehabilitation for someone in Matt's condition. It was a warehouse for the broken. As the weeks turned into months, the dust from the mortar settled into the creases of his palms, marking him with the debris of his own slow erosion. There was a profound tragedy in the stillness of those hands. Hands that had built homes and furniture for his neighbors, the same neighbors who now lived in a world where Matt Rollinger was nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered over evening meals. The 14 years stretched out before him like a long, featureless road. And as the sun dipped below the horizon outside the high prison walls, the darkness inside his cell became absolute. Within the confines of these cold Chicago stones, the air often carries the heavy, stagnant scent of old regrets. But few stories settled as heavily as that of John Walker. He was a man defined by his trade, a carpenter whose hands were accustomed to the honest grain of cedar and the steady rhythm of the mallet. Yet, in the winter of 1897, those same hands were trembling under a weight no timber could match. To look at John was to see a man carved from the very wood he worked, lean, weathered, and 52 years of age, with the stooped shoulders of a laborer who had spent a lifetime building structures for others while his own domestic life slowly rotted at the foundation. We find him in a cramped kitchen on a Tuesday evening, where the domestic silence was not peaceful, but brittle. The table was cluttered with the remnants of a day's frustrations. A half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey and the sour, yeasty smell of spilled beer that had begun to soak into the unfinished wood of the tabletop. A single candle flickered in the center, its flame struggling against a draft, throwing long, distorted shadows of his children against the plaster walls. Shadows that danced like ghosts before they had even become them. John's second marriage had never been a union of the spirit. It was a cold arrangement of convenience that had, over 4 years, soured into a landscape of constant jealousy and sharp-tongued distrust. His wife, a robust woman whose presence often seemed to dwarf his own thin frame, stood across the room, and the air between them was thick with a frenzy born of intoxication and long-simmered resentment. In a moment where the mind fractures under the weight of perceived provocation, John reached for an old pistol he had kept tucked away for years. It was a heavy, cold piece of iron that felt alien against the calluses of his palms. The kitchen, once a place of mundane nourishment, became the stage for a singular, shattering explosion. The ring of the shot was deafening in such a small space, a violent tear in the fabric of the evening that left a ringing silence in its wake. But as the smoke cleared, the target of his fury remained standing. Instead, the shadows on the wall had shifted forever. He had aimed at the source of his anger and struck the center of his heart. His favorite daughter, little Mary, had been caught in the path of the lead. The transition from life to memory happened in the time it took for a heart to beat once more. John collapsed to the floor, pulling the small, broken form of the girl into his lap. The weight of her was a crushing physical pressure against his chest, and the vibrant, terrifying red of her blood began to spread across his heavy carpenter's apron, staining the pockets where he usually kept his measuring tape and nails. When the authorities arrived, they found a man who had been hollowed out. During his later interviews, John would fall into fits of hysterical sobbing, the words catching in a throat constricted by a grief so profound it bordered on the divine. He told the investigators, with a voice that cracked like dry kindling, that he would gladly trade his own life 10 times over to bring the child back. He claimed a fog had descended upon him, a mental weakness that the judge later cited when sparing him from the gallows. Rather than the rope, John was given a life of silence behind bars, a sentence that served as a slow, rhythmic penance for a man who had destroyed the only thing he truly loved. The investigation concluded that John was, by nature, a harmless soul, a skilled mechanic of wood and joinery who had simply broken under a pressure he was never built to withstand. Now, the only things he builds are the memories of a kitchen filled with the scent of beer and the fading warmth of a daughter who would never grow old. As the heavy iron door clicks shut on the story of the carpenter, the seasons begin to shift in our journey, and the biting winds of the Chicago winter give way to a different kind of heat, one that rises not from a stove, but from the flickering, hungry flames of a restless mind. We travel now to the cell of a younger man, George Perry, where the silence is broken not by the sound of a carpenter's tools, but by the low, rhythmic chanting of a man trying to pray away the fire that dances behind his eyes. George Perry was 22 years old when he sat in the dim light of a Chicago jail cell, his fingers tracing the worn edges of a New Testament. For most of his life, the world had been a place of shifting walls and locked doors, a sequence of institutional hallways that began when he was only 9. He was a man of small stature and a mind that seemed to vibrate with an invisible tension, a byproduct of the epilepsy that had haunted him since childhood. The medical records of the era spoke of his condition as a nervous explosion, a physical storm that would regularly overtake his senses and leave him in a state of profound, drifting confusion. Before the flames and the arrest, George had been a wanderer. His mother had passed away from consumption, leaving him without the tether of maternal care. And his father was a man of modest means, living too far away to offer the support George so desperately needed. He had been discharged from an insane asylum against his own protest, cast out into a world where he had no home, no friends, and no clear path. He sought out odd jobs in the neighborhood, trading manual labor for the simple comforts of a dry bed and a warm meal. It was during one of these stints, while working for a farmer who George claimed treated him with a cold meanness, that the inner pressure finally found an outlet. The morning of the fire began with a visit to a nearby saloon. The sharp, medicinal burn of whiskey had done little to soothe the irritability that often preceded his fits. Instead, it seemed to sharpen the edges of his resentment. As he stood near the barn door later that morning, the wood felt rough and splintered beneath his touch. He could feel the onset of the aura, that peculiar, terrifying herald of a seizure. The air began to taste of copper, a metallic tang that coated his tongue, and a high, thin ringing started to vibrate in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the farmyard. In that state of heightened sensory distortion, George reached for a match. The texture of the match head against the dry wood of the barn door was a singular point of focus in a world that was starting to spin. With a single, sharp motion, the phosphorus ignited. The flare was small at first, a tiny bloom of orange and blue, but in George's mind, it was the only thing he truly possessed. Between his fits of epilepsy and the mutterings of Latin prayers, George Perry lived in a world where the only light he could control was the flame of a match. He watched as the hay caught, the fire spreading with a soft, hungry hiss that seemed to mirror the rushing sound in his brain. When the authorities later questioned him about why he had set the barn ablaze, George could offer no rational explanation. He spoke of his employer's unkindness, yet he admitted he did not truly know what had possessed him in that moment. It was as if the fire was a physical manifestation of the electrical storms in his head, a way to externalize a pain that had no name. in the quiet of his cell. The ugly disposition his cellmates feared would often melt away into a deep, sorrowful piety. He would spend hours whispering prayers in a mix of French and Latin, his voice a low rhythmic drone that filled the stone corners of the room. His cellmates would watch him from the shadows, unsettled by the way he seemed to commune with a world they could not see. He spoke often of his father, a man who did not smoke, chew, or drink, and expressed a quiet, crushing wish that he could be more like him. But the epilepsy remained a heavy veil between George and the life he wanted to lead. He was a young man, caught in a cycle of institutionalization and neurological chaos, a figure of tragedy who found his only brief moments of agency in the flicker of a strike-anywhere match. As the investigation concluded and the legal system processed his case, George remained a person of deep contradictions, a devout reader of the gospel who carried the scent of smoke in his clothes and a frantic, flickering light in his soul. The flickering light of George's story fades into the steady, artificial glow of the great department stores of downtown Chicago. In the late 1890s, these marble-floored cathedrals of commerce were places of intoxicating beauty, filled with the scent of expensive French perfume that hung heavy in the air, masking the sharper, colder smell of the winter wind rattling the window panes. Among the throngs of shoppers moving through the aisles of silk and lace, there was a young woman known to history only as Case 15. She was 20 years old, a native of the city, with a face described by those who studied her as pleasant and intelligent, though it carried a certain fly expression, a look of cautious, worldly sharpness hidden behind a lingering trace of modesty. She was a woman of rhythmic habits, her movements dictated by the swish of a heavy velvet cape that served as both her uniform and her sanctuary. Her life did not begin in the shadows of the fences and the criminal underground, but in a strict Catholic household with 5 brothers and 3 sisters. Yet, the gravity of a conventional life never seemed to hold her. While her siblings attended Sunday school with a quiet, willing devotion, she was a creature of the streets, playing truant more than half the time. Her rebellion was not born of a lack of means, but of a strange, internal hunger. When her mother sent her to the market for cabbages, she would steal the produce and pocket the coins, a small, early thrill that set the tempo for the years to come. By the age of 10, she was lifting handfuls of dimes and nickels from the candy store on the corner. By 11, she had graduated to the gleaming displays of the downtown stores, walking away with 2 watches in as many days. The death of her father in 1889 and her mother 3 years later dissolved the remaining ties to her childhood home. At 17, able to find a common language with her brothers, she stepped into the world of systematic thieving alongside a girl she had known in school. The two became a ghost-like presence in the city's busiest districts. We see her now, moving through a crowded aisle, the muffled sound of a velvet jewelry box being tucked into a hidden interior pocket lost beneath the chatter of the wealthy. Her own life was a series of 300 chapters, each one a theft hidden beneath the fold of a heavy cape. She took what she desired: ornaments, silks, jackets, and even hats. Operating with a frank and sociable disposition that made her nearly invisible to the suspicious eyes of floorwalkers. Despite her 4 stints in the Bridewell, and 5 in the county jail. She remained a person of curious contradictions. She never read novels, finding the reality of her own risks more compelling than fiction. Yet she never wavered in her belief in a divine power or a future state of rewards and punishments. She lived in a world of high stakes and quiet escapes, once even sharing a home with a man involved in the notorious Marshall murder trial. To her, the city was not a map of landmarks, but a map of opportunities, a collection of fences where stolen silk could be traded for survival. As the gaslights hummed overhead, she remained a woman of the drift, a shadow in velvet, always one step ahead of the silence that eventually claims every secret. But as the century turned and the heavy capes of the Victorian era began to fall out of fashion, the landscape of Colorado was preparing for a story of a much darker nature. We leave the crowded streets of Chicago behind and travel west toward the rugged ranch lands near Denver, where the quiet of the wilderness was about to be broken by a boy whose innocence was merely a mask for a chilling, calculated resolve.